Hey, everybody. Welcome to the Story Studio podcast. I'm Johnny. There's Sean. And there's the new Dave. Dave is not present today. We have somebody almost as angry and grumbly, Bonnie.
Bonnie is known for her rage.
I feel like I need to start stroking a beard or something.
I think
dead babies, dead babies.
You know what? It would be awesome if we had, like, anytime Dave couldn't show up on a show, we just had somebody from the studio who volunteered to play Dave. And I
think Joel could be a good Dave. He's got the beard. He's got an edge to him.
Well, Joel could totally do Dave, but he'd have to really lean into it and be Dave and not be Joel. So
Marie says his name is Joel.
He would have to. Yeah, Joel's a little.
Dave said some.
Positive.
Joel has said some seriously Davey shit in recent meetings, but he says them so much more bluntly than Dave. Like, yes. He'll just be like, "People are stupid motherfuckers," and that's all there is to it. And
okay, here's the difference. When Joel says something, it's definitely emphatic, and he knows he's right about it. There's a part of Dave.
But it's not a downer. It's not like oh, the world is fucked. It's more like, well, I'm gonna go punch it in the face and then drink some whiskey and I'm good.
Yes, yeah. Joel's not an Eeyore. Like, he may be a very angry rabbit, but he's not an Eeyore. Where when Dave is complaining about something, there's always a layer of self-loathing. Like, he feels emphatically what he's saying, but he also hates himself a little bit for saying it. And so there's never that with Joel.
All right. Well, so today we're going to be continuing the episode that we did before with Bonnie. It was just so value packed that we said let's break this into a second episode. So today we're doing Characterization Hacks Part 2, and we are doing it without Dave. That's a shame too, because Dave is good with characterization. We should have done some sort of marketing thing or whatever. Although we're not really doing that, so maybe that's not a thing. But anyway, so anything cool? Bonnie can come up with something cool if there is any. I didn't think I had one. I was going to be like, okay, fuck something cool. I'm tired of never having anything, but I do. It's just kind of a cheat.
Anything cool, Bonnie?
I do actually have something cool. I actually have been starting to listen to rewatch shows like Firefly and Community while I'm doing other things, and just listening to them from a dialogue perspective.
Oh, I love that.
And I am so falling in love with Dan Harmon's dialogue just all over again. Like the way that, like, just like how it just is like boom, 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 boom. And like every line is like a line that's like worth backing up and listening to again.
Do you watch Rick and Morty?
I love Rick and Morty. I can hardly wait for the rest of season 4.
I'm watching that with Austin.
Rick and Morty.
Mm-hmm.
I've only seen one episode of Rick and Morty, but I didn't love every season of Community, and I definitely thought it lost its steam. But when it was good, it was fantastic. And I love what it did with story structure itself and with the knowing. Like,
yeah, Robin was rolling her eyes at that, but I thought it was super cool.
I love that. I love when Abed is like, this is like a bottle episode, and then it's a bottle episode, and stuff like that just really, really tickles me. And so, yeah, Community really delivered. When Community delivered, it really delivered. And I like all of those actors, like, doing their thing.
They did one that was like, it was claymation or animation or something like that.
Yeah, it was like a Rankin Bass Christmas special.
I remember it was amazing. Yes. I remember thinking that episode was just fantastic.
Yeah, it was really unafraid. And what I love is that when I first, because I actually
because it had G.I. Joe. That's what it was. It was like it was a G.I. Joe sort of thing. That was so fantastic.
That's a different episode. They did a G.I. Joe.
Yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of where he's like, you just killed all those people. Aren't you upset? No, I didn't even think about it.
Yeah. What's amazing about Community too is I actually tried it once, just the pilot, and didn't get it. I watched it, and then it was only like, I don't know, 5 or 6 years later when the show was off the air, and I'd heard so many people tell me you really got to give it a chance, or they were really sad that it was going off the air. I'm like, why would anybody be sad about that piece of shit going off the air? And because I thought when I originally saw it, I'm like, this is not a premise that can hold up. They're friends at community college, which I realize now.
This is a show called Friends that was even simpler than that.
Yes, but these are like, just the whole premise was just ridiculous, and it seemed like a sitcom that was destined to fail. But I realized that's the point. Like the absurdity of the premise is part of.
They had some really good stuff. Like the Luis Guzman was the school celebrity and the statue. Just really understated shit like that was amazing.
Yes, the what do you call it? The mascot, the human
being.
Human being. That was amazing.
Oh, that guy was amazing.
Yeah, there's a lot to love about
Stacy
it.
says in the chat, don't hate on Friends. Oh, I don't hate Friends at all.
Yeah, we would never. We would never. The other show that was like, it's not anything like Community, but it's the same way, where I really didn't give it a fair chance. And the only reason I started watching it was because of Bonnie. And now I'm dying to see the final season is The Good Place. That lost steam for me at the end. I know you said you thought it got stronger and stronger, but I started getting more and more bored toward the end. Yeah, did you see through the final season?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know what happens in the final season, but I like that midway through the first season, you realize, oh, this is not the sitcom I thought it was. Like, it's going to change location, it's going to change personality, it's going to evolve. So I ended up being along for the ride.
Ooh, good something cool, Bonnie.
Yeah,
look at all the conversation it generated. Well, mine is personal, and it's nobody's going to give a shit about it but me and you. And I can see Bonnie caring, but I'm writing now, and it's like the first time in like a year that writing has felt good.
Oh, I do care. I care deeply about this.
It's been so hard. The mystery project that we've talked about a few times that was just like ate my face, and I had to revise it again and again. All the minutia that I don't like. And now, I mean, actually, the irony is that the one that I'm working on is the final part.
Whatever.
Well, no. The beam and the dream engine; those are going to be super hard. This is, by comparison, not as hard, but it is a world with a lot of lore. And I had to go through 4 books to get the lore, and I knew it was going to be tricky to. And like it's like, oh, and then this is the metaphor I keep using is, you know, swinging the bat with the weight on the end, and it's like, oh, okay, so this was supposed to be really hard, but after that last thing, which, by the way, I hear is good, but it felt really hard.
Yeah, it is good. There's still a little bit of like, you know what? The book that Johnny's talking about, the big one, is a little bit like a movie that just has too much footage. And we knew we needed to shoot a lot of extra stuff, and that it would be born in the editing room. Like, okay, we don't
like when Fellowship of the Ring was long as fuck, and then they said, hey, here's more. And I said, oh, I know why you cut it the first time.
Yes. Right. So, okay, that's a great analogy. We actually have the director's cut, except we want a more friendly audience cut. And so that's what we're trying to get in this final, you know.
It's not even a sacrifice. I could see people being like, oh, you have the director's cut and that's robust, and then you need to slim it down for commercial appeal. And that's not it. Like it's not. It's a bloated story without that.
Yeah. So we that's exactly it. We want to take out the bloat, but the story itself is excellent. And what's funny is that the story that Johnny's writing now was the thing that he put aside to start this because it was too hard. He was like, he got 20,000 words into it. And
that's sad to me because I remember how long ago it feels that I set this aside. So you sure it was for that last project? Because that means,
unfortunately,
that's how long I was on that project, because that feels so long ago.
No, I can think of something else that came in between, but pretty much, yeah.
But small, yeah.
Yeah. I got something cool. It's not a new show, but it is a show that I really enjoyed, and it's totally different than Watchmen, but it's the second time this year that I would say, yeah, that's a masterpiece. And it's a show that's been in my Netflix queue forever, but I finally watched it. And it was a show that made me really appreciate working with Bonnie, actually. This is no surprise to her. We talked about this yesterday, but it's the show Broadchurch. And it's a BBC murder mystery. I was explaining this to Neve this morning, and I realized that the setup is Twin Peaks. It's a small town. 11-year-old Danny Latimer, washes up on the shore, and it's about who killed Danny Latimer.
Oh, I need to watch Twin Peaks, actually. It's
the same premise as Twin Peaks, handled very, very, very differently. But it's not about the murder itself. It's just more about. It's about the people. It's about all the secrets, all the stuff that I love in that kind of fiction. And I knew who it was. The end did not surprise me like it probably should have. And it's not because they didn't do a good job of obscuring it or anything like that. It was masterfully told. The reason I cottoned on to who it was because of a line of dialogue said by one of the other characters that was the kind of thing that Bonnie and I would brainstorm out. It's this kind of thing, oh, let's have this character say this thing because it sets up this other thing. And so as soon as that character said it, I'm like, oh, that's who did it. But the show itself is beautiful. Stacy says the American version wasn't good. I didn't even know there was an American version of Broadchurch. But the BBC version, it's got David Tennant in it. Oh, Grace Point it's called. Never even heard of that. But Broadchurch is excellent. And I didn't know about the second or third season because after seeing the first, I can't really imagine how they could repeat that. But Bonnie says the whole series is phenomenal. So yeah.
It's just really different because it's not about the murder anymore. They have two other crimes that one of them kind of unravels Ellie's character more and one of them unravels David Tennant's character more. So if you love those two characters, it's amazing.
Well, I imagine they've got to deal with like the aftermath of that first one and like a court trial or something. I was imagine where it would go. Yeah. Well, it's worth it. I'm definitely going to stick around. I'm digging it.
Before we begin, I have a question that I've always wanted to ask, and that's behind you, Bonnie, there is a table, and there's never anything on that table. And it just sort of looks like it's stuck there temporarily, but it's always there, and there's never anything on it.
It's a sacrificial table.
Yeah, I'm really curious what's going on with that table back there.
Yes, that's where I kill the chickens before I start writing every morning.
Good answer, good answer.
No,
how many chickens do you kill before you start writing?
At least 3.
Is it like 1,000 words per chicken?
Well, it kind of depends because like how much blood they have, you have to like get the circle to be all the way complete so that the demon can't get out. So
that's efficient.
No, it's usually a mess. It's like usually where I actually spread all my papers out so I can see multiple things at once. I just clean it up for the podcast because I feel like that's
oh yeah, because I don't think I've ever seen it full or I'm not paying attention, which is also possible.
I have, but not on podcast episodes.
All right. Anyway, well, so this will be a bullet point in the notes so people can be clear. This is the one where we talked about Bonnie's table and everybody knows about it. Moving into characterization, though, I know it's a step down. So let's just, I mean, we did half of this before, so we've already done the intro. Go back and look at all that stuff. But we're talking about characterization and specifically kind of hacks, how to shortcut your way to better characters. And so maybe a good way to start is, what would you say, like, what's the functional difference between an everyman character, a realistic character, a larger than life character? Because, I mean, I always feel like there's kind of war, and you can have somebody who's like a blank slate and they're an everyman, but then you have these, you really over the top characters like, I mean, Indiana Jones is maybe somewhere in the middle, and a really crazy character is somebody like Ignatius Riley from Confederacy of Dunces or something like that. So where do they all fit, and when would you use them, and what's their purpose?
I really see them as a spectrum of how closely they represent the reader's perspective, because the everyman is like supposed to be super relatable so the reader can project themselves into the everyman and kind of like be in the story that way. So you don't want the everyman to have any characteristics that are an obstacle to the reader getting into their head. And I think we might have talked about this a little bit last time, where Neo, he doesn't have like any really strong personality, and he doesn't have like, we have no idea what his backstory is, and we don't have any of the usual things that you put like in a realistic character, but he's very curious, which we're all curious. He's skeptical, we're all skeptical. He likes a noodle shop, and he has this kind of really existential angst that probably everybody who hasn't felt like their life is going well has had. So he's like very easy for the reader to project themselves into. Realistic characters are less easy to project yourself into. It's like you have to be more like the character to put yourself in their shoes or in their head, but they're more entertaining you. They're more fun to watch. And there you have to have realistic characters for drama. It's really hard to do drama if you don't have some realistic characters in there.
Yeah, because automatically you're unplugged and it becomes more comedy, or it's farce.
Yes, because larger than life characters are characters who are not going to be like the reader at all in terms of like, they usually have exaggerated personality traits. They usually have like amazing skills that a reader is never going to have. And they're more like wish fulfillment characters where you might look up to them or want to be cool like them or just really enjoy watching them cause destruction or,
Yeah, they
you
don't
know,
work as main characters. They're like, you can have a funny, larger than life character in a drama if they're not the lead, if they're like coming in and offering a moment of comic relief or, you know,
Well, how hard and fast is that? Because I can think of some of the things that we've written that have very large main characters.
I was going to say, I think with larger than life characters, they can be protagonists, but you're watching them for entertainment value. You're not imagining yourself being the character so much, like Conan the Barbarian, totally over the top, right? And that's why a lot of fantasy and science fiction characters, like there's like a huge amount of larger than life characters, like Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, right? They're very much, they have super strong personalities, like amazing abilities. And we all kind of want to be like them and they're relatable, but they're characters that you admire or look up to or are entertained by rather than like you're not projecting yourself directly into their heads as much.
Would you say a character like that needs a foil?
A lot
Because
of the
some of the ones that
times.
I'm thinking of, they don't have this stage to themselves. They always have somebody who's, you know, able to counterbalance them or let the reader see, okay, yes, I as the author understand this guy's crazy. I'm letting him be crazy.
Yes, definitely. And it's really usual to have that like Sherlock and Watson, right? Sherlock is over the top, larger than life. And Watson is the everyday guy who we can all relate to, who not only explains Sherlock to us, but he also does tone Sherlock down enough that we can relate to some of the things Sherlock is doing too.
yeah, that's a really good point because a Sherlock show without Watson, it's manic. Like it's not.
Well, that's what we did with not Futurama, with Space Shuttle. I mean, it's a ridiculous example, but we needed an everyman for that because it was too many crazy people. And you needed somebody to, I wouldn't say you self-insert with him as much because it was a crazy comedy, but it's much more like a nod, like, okay, yeah, we know this is crazy. Just stick with us. That's the way
Yeah,
a foil always feels to me.
this isn't exactly a drama. I mean, it is a rom-com, but I think enough people have seen it to kind of maybe get the reference. But in Notting Hill, right, where you have a very, you've not seen it, Bonnie?
I haven't, no.
Okay, well, there's Hugh Grant is a very more of a straight character in that, but his roommate is just a fucking.
Oh, that guy was awesome.
Yeah, he's awesome. But if he was the lead in the movie, you wouldn't be able to take the movie seriously. It would be a screwball comedy. But even though it's a comedy, it's anchored in reality. Like you believe that Hugh Grant is a real person. You believe that Julia Roberts, within the context that you're given, is a real person. But then because it's supposed to be a comedy, but they're anchoring it in more real, genuine feelings, it's not screwball. So when the roommate is on the scene, it is screwball. He's just like, he's ridiculous. He walks around. I don't even remember the things he does. I know he walks around naked. I know that he does just ridiculous things.
Yeah,
like
I remember watching it again
t-shirts.
and laughing again, and I can't remember any of the thing he does.
Yeah, but he's that character where every time he comes on, you're invested in him for a few minutes. You're laughing, but you're enjoying that comedy, and it doesn't in any way take away from the drama that's happening on the other side of the story.
Yeah, and I haven't read Space Shuttle, the novel, but I did read the pilot that you guys worked on. And I think that even though that main character was not exactly an everyman, I think he was basically the emotional gauge for that episode because like this insanely crazy shit was happening around him. And his reactions kind of tell you like, how worried should I be about this? And like, is it okay for me to laugh at this? Right? It's like he kind of is your baseline in the episode for like, how to interpret all of the other alien characters who are doing all this crazy stuff.
I always feel like a character like that is almost a get out of jail free card. That's the way that I tend to use them. I can think of, okay, so this isn't a great parallel, but I've sort of thought about this. You know how like just society's pulse changes and people will say, okay, if you go back and you watch the Friends episodes, you know, because I've already mentioned Friends, there are some that kind of make you cringe, and you're like, oh, okay. But then those same basic jokes or the sort of things that could also be offensive could be on something like It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, where suddenly it's okay because the slant of
because they were never trying to be wholesome ever.
Well, it's the things that Joey does that are cringeworthy are presented as normal. It's like there's tacit approval from the writers and the producers and everybody who's behind that show. Whereas it's clear, it's clear in something like It's Always Sunny that these are reprehensible people, or I will tend to use a foil character as just like, okay, I'm over here witnessing how ridiculous this guy is. And so then that guy can be as offensive and ridiculous as I want because I've sort of have a pressure gauge.
And I think even with Rick and Morty too, you see a little bit of that. It's like Morty and Summer make Rick's bullshit more believable.
Right. So Rick will do something really, really terrible and offensive, and then Morty will go, "Oh, are you sure that that's a good idea, Rick?" And that's all it takes. Like once he said that, then you're like, "Oh, okay, I guess he's going to do it. And it's going to be terrible." Okay, so what about I mean, there was a thing here. I have a note about like a classic character. I'm realizing I don't have the thing up, so I want to move past that, and I'll come back where I can find the list that I had about classic characters. But I mean, how important is a commercial character? Because I could see going back and forth on this. If somebody said make your character more commercial, I imagine a lot of people would kind of revolt at that and be like, well, wait a minute, it's my character is my character. So what do you mean there?
It's actually only in the last year that I've even been thinking this way, but it started when I interviewed Sean for the premise book, and I was trying to kind of get him to articulate for me what the difference was between a commercial premise and a non-commercial premise. And we came up with like 3 criteria that are really important, and we were looking at a lot of different movies that we were comparing that were cult classics versus blockbusters. And the 3 criteria were that it has to be really accessible, both the characters and the world. It has to have wow factor, and for premise, that means like in the Matrix, that like really huge idea that when people realize that that's what the story is about, they go wow. So for the Matrix, it was, what if we're living in a virtual reality? And then there's whiz bang, which is like all the cool, amazing details that kind of suck you in and make you really want to spend time in the world and spend time with the characters. So once we had that, I started thinking about, well, if that's really important for premise, how do characters need to support that for the story to be commercial? And what I came up with is again, accessibility, which is something we're all striving for anyway, making our characters really relatable, giving them universal hopes and fears, giving them dreams that the reader can understand, giving them beliefs that the reader can get behind. And helping us really understand them by generating sympathy and empathy. So I think characters that don't have a high level accessibility are not good at supporting a commercial premise, because if you can't relate to the characters, the premise becomes less accessible because of just the reader can't get into it. And then for wow factor, I'm thinking of that right now as being tied to character arc. Like, what is the moment that the character gets their shit together and they completely step into their power, and they have this moment where they do something amazing that kind of blows you away. And for the Matrix, that's when Neo decides to embrace his identity as the one, and he achieves godlike powers and totally destroys Agent Smith. And then
he also says whoa at that point, I believe. That's how you know.
He does. And then for whiz bang, those are fun details that make the character more appealing, like being able to upload knowledge into your brain, and like having a cool trench coat and the glasses. Right, the I know Kung Fu moment is part of the whiz bang. And then just like all the amazing fight scenes that Neo was able to do because he knew Kung Fu. So when I'm thinking now about characters, like once we have a premise that we're trying right now to write things that the kinds of stories that you would actually get in literary fiction, but we're trying to make them so accessible that somebody who doesn't like literary fiction but who wants those kinds of emotional stories of transformation, how do you make those feel like commercial fiction and use commercial fiction techniques but still convey that literary type story that's very heavy in character arc?
Yeah, I think part of making a character, like you could take a really big Hollywood over the top character and make him accessible. And Bonnie already said that accessibility is super important, but it's easier to do if you have the right approach. So for example, Indiana Jones is a pretty over-the-top character. You know, he's an archaeologist who travels all over the world. He uses a fucking bullwhip as his weapon, which is just rad. And like, who thought of that? Actually, I know. I've read the transcript. I know who thought of that. But the whole thing is just, he's a really awesome character, and he seems to have no fear. You know, he walks in and there's all these giant spiders and he's just knocking them off. But he's afraid of snakes. Like that, just, it's so stupid, but that totally humanizes him. That the opening of Raiders is a classic, like just amazing opening. You know, all of it works. Him running from the boulder, all of it is just rad. But what really makes it work is the last note of that scene is him getting in the plane, it's taking off, and he's like, oh, a snake. You've seen him outrun like these hostiles who are like poison darts, and he handles it all like a champ. You know, Belloc is threatening his life. He stares him down. None of this is an issue until there's a snake, and it's a little snake. It's a pet snake. It's not even a poisonous snake. It might bite him. It's the pet snake who belongs to the pilot.
Reggie.
Wow, amazing. So that's a way of humanizing that character. You can do it, you know, Negan on Walking Dead is a super over-the-top character, but because he's got like a folksy way of talking and he's funny, you know, he has humorous elements, that makes him relatable. Something that John.
This is why I never liked Superman.
Right, because he's not relatable. He's God, you know, like, so yeah. That is a problem.
And that's really, sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, Johnny does this a lot in ways that he makes characters relatable is in the way that they argue, because they argue about real things that real humans do. So like, you know, if you've got like a superhuman character, or he's someone who's super, super rich, or like whatever, but he's still like trying to, you know, fit that last dish in the dishwasher, then we understand him, we relate to him because we've tried to fit the last dish in the dishwasher.
This is funny for me because I don't like this I never think about this when I'm writing. So I'm actually kind of reverse engineering this as I'm thinking, and I'm listening to everything. I'm going, oh, it does sound good, and I feel like I'm hitting those things, but I don't think about them consciously. I was going to ask because I actually don't feel like I have a lot of everyman characters. I feel like I do realistic characters and over the top characters, and maybe there's a little bit of everyman in there, but maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
I think everything I've read of yours was either realistic or over the top or a combination. I haven't read everything you've written, so Sean would know better.
Yeah, I would say we don't traffic in the everyman at Realms and Sands very much. No, I mean, everyone I'm immediately coming up with, I'm like, that's so yeah, I don't think that we've done a lot of everyman. Dave really likes the everyman character. That is something that Dave will very much use, and in fact, I think he's got a lot better about that. He used to have, in fact, you know, our very first series, the weakest character by far is the everyman character that we started.
And what's his name?
You would think it'd be Stan.
Oh no, I thought it was John. Is it not John?
No, it's Brent. I want to say.
Okay, I thought you purposely named him something that was like the most common name because he was an everyman. But Brent's reasonably common.
Yeah, no, John was one of the neighbors in Mary's story, which was actually on mine. But no, it was the reporter, you know, and Dave.
There's a stock character. Dave likes that reporter.
It's a very stock character. So here's Dave's character in that series. He's a reporter who has, I think, a 3-year-old son, and his son was 3 at the time. And he doesn't spend enough time with his son. He's always working, and like it's Dave on the page, right? And so Dave always used to have that everyman character, but Dave's done a good job of growing as an author to where he's making his everyday characters a little more relatable and a little less milquetoast.
Yeah, and that's not a knock, by the way. I mean, I certainly have stock characters that I use over and over again.
Oh, well, I think everybody does. And to your point, Johnny, I never like dissected my own shit like that at all. It's only through working with Bonnie where she's, you know, constantly asking me questions about why I do things where I have to think about it, right? So like she said, the whole thing started with this premise book, and, you know, she's trying to figure out my process, which makes me understand my process better, which, you know, has made me a better writer in the time that we've worked together. But you don't know until you start talking about it, because honestly, the people who know exactly what they do and why they do everything they do before they start writing probably aren't writing or growing fast enough, because they're too stuck in analysis and not in doing.
I did find, so we were going to talk about classic characters, and but when is this, so this is from the draft of a book that I wrote that I believe has gotten postponed a fair amount. Do we have any plans for this book? Is it just sort of on the shelf?
Yeah, it's on the shelf because we want to, there's two things. We want to complete all of it before we release any of it. And
you mean it's part of a several volume set?
It's part of the core curriculum. So there's a lot there, but also we just, like, our focus is just too much on fiction right now. We don't want to slow down there. So the core curriculum is something that we're generating internally to teach our authors. And it's just, we create them when we have time, and it has to take a backseat to the fiction.
Create them internally, and then they will be released publicly. So it's
correct.
Not,
yeah.
And I will say, just since I'm thinking of it, if you want to be on the list for when these things do come out, when we talk about these sorts of things, sterlingandstone.net/stonetable. Anyway, so that this book is, I had a section in here on, it's about elements of classics, which is, by the way, a tricky thing to write about, because you feel pretentious from word one. And it's not like I've written anything that is as of yet a classic, because only time can usually make a classic, right? So who knows?
Space Shuttle.
Space Shuttle is definitely a classic. So I'll just run through these kind of quickly, because I don't want to belabor them, but then pull out any of these that you guys want to talk about if you feel that this is good. I said that the first and foremost, and I said in the text, it's actually not that helpful, but that it's the truest thing, is that classic characters are memorable through one way, shape, or form. They could be memorable for being terrible, for being awesome, for being clumsy, for being having a physical attribute or a habit, but they're memorable. Like they don't just slip out. And then I think I went to my favorite punching bag, which I did enjoy, but it's very plot driven. The Da Vinci Code. Sorry, Dan Brown. I still like you. But those characters, they are the opposite of memorable to me. I do not have any idea, other than it was Robert Langdon and Tom Hanks played him in the movie. And I think the woman was Sophie, but that's only because I'm good at names. So I don't remember anything about those characters. So even though that's a classic novel, I would not say they are probably classic characters.
Reggie.
I did remember Reggie. I did remember John O'Matt as well. Remember that guy?
I do.
So some more breakdowns. I said that they're interesting and they do interesting things, which is almost as unhelpful. It basically means
wait.
They're memorable and they're interesting.
And they do interesting things.
I do go on, and there is elaboration in the text too. The memorable, I said that it's kin to it, and it's like a character needs to. If you have a book that's very interesting, but the character themselves, there's nothing remarkable. The reason is because I mentioned memorable in the text, and then I had a bullet for interesting. So okay, they're the same thing. I said that they're bold. They tend to do something that we wouldn't do, and it isn't necessarily all of them. There are definitely timid classic characters. There's kind of no hard and fast rules here, but most of them do tend to be in some way an aspirational character, somebody that has an attribute that we wish we had or that more people had. In some way, shape, or form, they do tend to be larger than life. They stand out, but they could stand out for being meek just as much as they could stand out for being big. So Don Draper from Mad Men is not going to go unnoticed in a corner. Like, he's larger than life, just his presence is large. I did mention aspirational. Usually we want to emulate a part of a classic character, if not all of them, and not always. I did say that they're relatable. So that's what we talked about before with they're not everymen or every people. I feel like that should be more inclusive, but they are relatable. So even though Starling in Silence of the Lambs is an FBI agent who goes after killers, and we might not ever be able to do that, we understand her in part because of the story she tells about the lambs and how Hannibal Lecter gets in her head. They are flawed, and this is the converse of what I mentioned with Superman. He feels like I know technically, okay, he has kryptonite, but whatever, they aren't flawed in the way that Indiana Jones is afraid of snakes. And then the last one that I mentioned is that they're layered and complex. So they don't tend to be one-dimensional. No matter what their outward attributes are, it's not the whole story.
And I just want to say, like, I think that's really interesting what you were saying. I think a lot of the traits that you're describing there are usually associated with larger than life characters. But like, I think what you said there about them also being memorable, it kind of made me think about like Treasure Island. Because like I could never remember who the kid is. Like the kid, I've read Treasure Island, I never remember his name, but like he's an everyman who's there to just show you Flint and Silver and like all these other amazing larger than life characters, and that's who you take home from Treasure Island, right? But then when they made Black Sails, they did something really different with those characters, because all of a sudden they were like the larger than life characters from Treasure Island were the main characters. And so they had to really do that Indiana Jones with the snake thing and humanize them and make them show us a lot more of their realistic side beneath the larger than life characteristics in order to make the story that they told their work.
Yeah, and I think too, something to note is that even everyman characters can be memorable for the choices they make. So for instance, the example you gave is Neo. So Neo is an everyman, but he's extraordinary because he takes the leap, both figuratively and literally. We just watched the Truman Show as a family recently again, and Truman is not remarkable except that he is. Well, I think it holds up well.
I think
and he has those remarkable. I think so too, and I think that his quaint, his almost naivete, you know, how he's like, in case I don't see you, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, or whatever. Those things feel like I don't think a classic character needs to have all those things and have them 100%, but I think that those are sort of some tendencies.
Yeah, and I think that what you're saying there, like in terms of, like, I think a lot of the saying that, like, I think what you said about like Neo being memorable because he takes the leap, right? He's an everyman who we've been bonding with for the whole movie, but then he does the thing that we're all afraid to do. And I think with Truman, it's a little bit the same thing. He does something remarkable at the climax of the story in terms of being willing to go to a dangerous, scary place instead of retreat back into where he could be safe. And I think that's why both of those, even though they're everyman characters, they're memorable because we remember how that feels to do something that we would be terrified to do in real life.
And I also think that Truman has a choice that a lot of people have sort of metaphorically, which is I noticed something, I learned something, and then now am I going to just kind of go back to sleep, go back to what, like, okay, so the world is in coronavirus panic right now, right? So when we're all done, are we just going to go right back to exactly what we did 100%, or are we going to sort of analyze?
I think that's the big question we're all wondering right now. And it's
right. So we're a bunch of Trumans. Are we just going to go back to it blindly, or are we going to say, I can't ignore this anymore? I mean, what was the stat about, like, as China started to loosen up, there was like a huge divorce rush or something?
Yeah. And I don't want to derail us with coronavirus, but Jen actually posted that really great article that was basically talking about how
the gaslighting one.
Yes,
I've seen that from another source. Forget. That's great.
It was so good, yeah. But,
okay, so we know about arc. Like we've talked about arc a lot, but when we're talking about character arc over a series, this is a sort of question we get: arc or plot over a series. But in this case, like, if a character has an arc for a book, how do you extrapolate that to say, okay, well, they need to then grow in book 2 and book 3, so there's a series arc as well?
Yes, that for me, like, has always been something I've been wrestling with, and I actually had a breakthrough when I looked at Doctor Who.
Oh.
Because it's such a massive series, right? And like, but the Doctor has arcs, and what they do is they've given him multiple arcs because they've given him multiple backstory wounds. They have him work through the arcs that he does have in each incarnation. He has one arc per version of him, but he works through it kind of in phases, and they explore different facets of the arc through different issues and different people that he meets. You can break a big arc into like smaller arcs, like the Harry Dresden series does that really incredibly well. where Harry Dresden's arc, and I think we're about to get books 16 and 17 out of 24 that Busher is supposed to have had planned. And it's the same question in every book, is like, is the power that Harry is going to have to accumulate in this adventure in order to save his friends going to corrupt him? But like in every book, they explore that corruption in a different way, in a different relationship. And you can also give the main character difficult issues to wrestle with, which is something else they do a lot in Doctor Who, where he'll have a problem where there's someone he can't help, or there's a social issue where there's just no good solution. And he has that internal conflict that you would usually get in a character arc, but it's not actually moving his character arc forward. And then he has all these different allies that the people that he travels with, and then also the people he's helping, they often have character arcs. His companion usually has one, maybe two, and then he's got people that he's trying to save. They often have character arcs. So there's tons of character change in that series, even though Doctor Who changes very, very, very slowly over time. And another thing you can do that is kind of like a trick, and we just did this in the novel that I think Sean is going through right now and doing the line edit on. It's a story about a guy who, it's not a series, but it's a trick that works really well in series, where the main character is he's been sober for 364 days, and this is like his 1 year. Yeah, it's his 1 year sobriety, and his character arc, we gave him an external behavior that could actually show the reader where he is in his character arc throughout the whole story. And it's kind of fixated on a meaningful location. It's his father's house. And he blames his father for, it's okay that I tell this, Sean, right?
Yeah, no, it's totally
fine. He blames his father for his becoming an alcoholic. And he starts the story, it's like he's lost everything. He and his wife he's separated from and his kid are living in this like mother-in-law house on his father's property. And his character arc is kicked off by his father saying, I'm selling the house, you've got to find another place to live. And then throughout the story, as his character arc keeps getting triggered, what he tries to do is he keeps trying to find ways to buy his father's house. He tries to pressure his father into it. He tries to get a mortgage. He tries to get a mortgage sneakily using his wife's information. He goes to a skeezy place to try and see if he can get funded. So he's like doing all these things every time he feels like my life is fucked and it's my father's fault. It's like he's trying to get control of his father's house. And at the climax of the story, when he realizes that he's been living in this hell for a year, but he realizes that his father has been living in the same hell for his whole life, and it's not really his father's fault that he's an alcoholic, he gives up on the idea of buying the house, and he accepts that he's going to have to move on and let go of his childhood home. And then at the end, at the beginning, we saw him resenting that he's living in this like little mother-in-law house on his father's property. But at the end of the story, you see that we find out his wife has bought the house, and the wife is like, if you want to be near the kid, you can live in the mother-in-law house. And he's grateful for the opportunity to live in the same place that he was resenting living in at the beginning of the story. So if you have like a big series where you have a character who's changing very slowly over time, and maybe you even have like a whole book where the arc isn't moving forward, if you've got something external and physical that the character can take action toward or do something about when their arc is being triggered, that is actually something that the reader can kind of glom onto mentally, and they may not consciously associate it with the character arc moving forward, but unconsciously that symbolism of like every time they go back to the father's house, he's trying to do something, it's associated with that internal conflict. So it becomes a symbol of how the character is changing when you see how their actions toward it change.
Yeah, you can also do like a real slow burn too, where, you know, people in movies, it's different because you kind of need the character to be almost fundamentally different 2 hours later than they were when you started. And that doesn't feel like real life, which I think is one of the reasons that TV is exploding so much right now, because the storytelling feels more authentic to us. You know, we get to spend more time with characters and it makes a difference. So you can have someone change without changing entirely. So one of my favorite character arcs of all time, which is also one of the most frustrating, is Don Draper. So we've already talked about Don Draper a little bit. I love this character. He also just infuriates me. And I've now seen the show 3 times because Cindy and I watched it a second time together, and then we just watched it with Haley. So I'm really, really intimately familiar with Don Draper and all his shenanigans. Every time I'm expecting something different. And every time I'm watching this, I'm like, why? Why do you keep doing these things? And even after, like, you know, the 7th season, he's still engaging in the same destructive behaviors, even though he's really trying not to. You see him trying, but he's human and he keeps fucking up and doing these terrible things. But you still see him taking absolute growth in certain places. So in the very first episodes, he is lying about who he is. He's not proud at all of who he is. And then one of the final shots in the last season is he's standing next to his children, and they're looking up at this dumpy shack of a whorehouse that he grew up in, and he's showing them. He's sharing this experience with him, with his children, which is the opposite of what he was willing to do. So even though he's still making bad choices, he's at least aware of the choices he's making, which is step 1. Because he's not even aware earlier. Like he thinks he's living his best life until the world has to shake him a little bit. But by the end, even if he's making poor choices, he is aware, and not all of his choices are poor, and he is doing some of the hard things, like, this is where I came from, which is probably the hardest thing for Don Draper to say. And to say it in front of his children in that way shows substantial growth, but it actually feels like the kind of growth you would expect from a person. Okay, well, they're still not able to do this thing at all, but at least they could do that thing. And, you know, for any of us who have dealt with our children or our parents or friends that are frustrating or whatever, we see that. Okay, well, they haven't figured this thing out, but at least they've got that thing.
I was figuring we could maybe close up with one more, but there is some stuff that I skipped. So just if there's anything else that you guys want to ping in with, great. But let me ask this. So this is something that that I've struggled with. I sort of have my own thoughts on it, and it's something that I've seen done poorly many times in TV, film, and books. And that's introductions, especially when there's more than one, especially when there's a large cast that needs to be introduced or several people. So if you have to introduce characters and make, you know, readers care about them, what are your best tips on how to do that while making each of them distinct in a reader's mind?
That is like such a hard thing to do. And I've been studying actually a lot of characterization, character introductions in books that I've been reading. And I mean, you've heard all the tips, like don't have them look in the mirror, don't give a fashion show and describe every last detail of their clothes, and don't give the driver's license stats, and don't give their resume and stop the scene to tell the reader everything about them. But even when you're consciously not doing those things, it's really hard to figure out like what's relevant, like what's the most important thing the reader has to understand about the character. And the rules of thumb I've come up with for myself are, first of all, you need to be really focused. You have to go like, what is the impression I want this character to make right away with the reader, and kind of fuck the rest of the details, right? It's like, don't try to let the reader know everything there is about the character, but do think about like how you can make that impression and have that impression be an emotional journey, like a little teeny ride that you're going to take the reader on. So when you're showing the character in action, is there a way that you can have them do something that would just make the reader curious? Because if you can make the reader want to know more about the character, it doesn't matter that they don't know 99% of what the character is all about. You've hooked them enough that they're like, I'm going to stick with this character because I have to figure that out. And in terms of the other thing is stakes. Is like trying to immediately like put the character in a situation right away where we don't know what they're going to do and there are stakes. And that's another way to really hook readers really quickly on a character, is they immediately sense that like, I don't know what this character is going to do and something could go terribly, terribly wrong here. But if you look at like the Princess Bride opening, for example, it actually is very quiet in the book, not the movie. It starts out with the character William Goldman talking about a teacher who was just really frustrated with him, who he really, really liked and probably had a crush on. And it's a very, very short introduction, but it tells the story of him being called into a teacher's conference and how his mother and all the other adults in his life and the teacher just basically are like, what are we going to do with you, Billy? Like, what are we like? And that question, he uses that as a refrain. And he's told you very little about himself except that he just would rather be outside playing. But like, he's got this refrain of frustration that like everybody in his life, he knows he's disappointing and he doesn't know what to do about it.
Dave.
And if you can't love, right, if you can't love him at the end of that scene, there's like, you probably, I don't see how you can't, because if you're a human being and you've ever been afraid of disappointing someone, it's very hard not to connect with him and understand like how scared he was when he was a kid. And you don't know all these other things about him. He told you about his screenwriting career later and all this other detail that he gets into, but you don't need it right now. You just need to know that he's someone who doesn't want to disappoint you, and he did. So thinking about it that way, and I guess the other example that is probably a little bit easier if you haven't read The Princess Bride is like the Deadpool movie. I just admire the way they introduced Deadpool so much in that first movie, because they could have, he's famous for breaking the fourth wall and talking to the reader, right? It would have been so easy for them to just like have him give like a 5-minute snarky monologue about how he became Deadpool and who he's fighting and what his deal is. And instead they like start out with that frozen scene in the middle of like all that mayhem that they're just panning around, and you see him and he's in a car and there's things flying around and he's like pantsing one of the villains who's flying out of the window at the same time that he's punching the other one. And it's like, you don't have to know anything about him to know that he's like ultra violent, and you're going to see a whole bunch of stuff that you shouldn't take too seriously. And he hasn't said a word, he hasn't done anything, it's just like a still image that they float around. And then they switch to him in the car like 20 minutes earlier, and he's talking to his cab driver about the girl that the cab driver's in love, and he like is very sympathetic and compassionate and a little bit crazy, but it's all about like, oh well, don't give up on her, Darpenter, don't make the mistake I did, don't let love go. And so that immediately tells you how he's had this big wound romantically that he's kind of not dealing with, but also it's kind of infusing every part of his personality. And we still haven't seen him beat up any bad guys really, or blow anything up, or he hasn't said any snarky fourth wall stuff. But he just like, it gives you this really vulnerable moment with the cab driver, which I thought was really brave considering that it was a comic book movie, right? Where he's supposed to be like this over the top, snarky, badass.
Yeah, that script breaks a lot of convention in the best possible way.
I have 3 thoughts on this. So particularly what frustrates me is when multiple characters are introduced and you lose track of them because they're not distinct enough. And then you can have the over the top way of doing that where somebody realizes that that's an issue. And so they make them, okay, this one, has a giant scar across his face, and this one wears a big cowboy hat. Like they do something absurd that doesn't like whatever.
This one wears a good cowboy hat is always good. It's always great.
Right. With the drink, like a foam dome. So the 3 things that I thought of are, number 1, make them distinct, which should sound like a no-brainer, but it's not, present company included. When Sean and I wrote The Dream Engine, there were like 6 people whose names started with W. And so since W is not a real common first letter, your brain thinks they're all the same person. Is it Willoughby? Is it Wellington? Is it, like there's just so many of them. So I would say like with names and maybe appearances, if that comes in, they do need to be distinct. Another would be to try to go slow if you can. I know that in some series I know I have a bunch of people I need to introduce. And so what I would try to do is to introduce 1 or 2 and then let the reader get used to them. And then later I would introduce another 1 or 2, and then I would let the reader get used to them. And then the counterpoint to that is sometimes you do need a large room, and you need it early before people are used to all those characters. And I think and I'm going to see if I can articulate this, maybe you guys can help me, is I think that there's a way of writing or filming, if it's visual, that implies importance of a character. And a lot of times in those first, like if you have a large cast originally, there's only one or two you really need to pay attention to. But if you don't make that clear, then the reader's mind is using RAM basically to try and follow them all. And so I would say one hack might be if your point of view character doesn't know everybody, then they can just kind of like that guy over there or something. You don't get names, you don't get introductions. And that can sort of be like, well, it's just a guy over there. It doesn't matter, even if that guy's really relevant later. And if you imply importance of a character, then the spotlight's on you and you need to make sure that that person is memorable. So those are sort of some of my thoughts on that.
Yes. Yeah. And sorry.
No, please go.
I was just going to say, one of the things when I was studying character introductions is I was looking at groups, and Chuck Wendig has a couple of tricks that are really amazing for this. For example, he'll have the character come in and he'll just describe the group, like a group of misfits or a group of whatever. He'll find some really colorful way to characterize the group as a whole. And then he'll have one person in the group say something and start have a small conversation with the point of view character. And so then we know that person. And then a little bit later in the scene, he'll go back to that description of the group and somebody else from the group will say something. So he's doing what you're saying in terms of feeding it out slowly so we don't have to know everyone at once, but he's also using that tag description of who the group is to kind of let you know, by the way, we're going to keep coming back to these characters. These people are important, but they're not so important that you need to know all of their faces right now.
Like at the beginning of Reservoir Dogs, trying to keep track of who's what color is overwhelming until you realize it doesn't really matter until a little bit in. And then it's like, okay, it's mainly Mr. White, Mr. Orange, and Mr. Pink. Like that's mainly what it is.
Why do I got to be Mr. Pink? Yeah.
Do you know that in the script, it was originally Mr. White complaining about a lot of it was the same shit. It was like the Steve Buscemi character. They had the Harvey Keitel character saying it. It's like, it's so much better the other way.
I did. Two thoughts on that. The first is it is important, not just in the way things look, but in the way they sound. So Johnny's totally right about the Willoughby and all of our W characters in that series. But in just the thing I was writing this morning, we had a Quentin Porter and then a Constance Palmer. And like I immediately, I changed the Constance Palmer because it was too close, like as far as the sound. So do be aware of that. And even if it's one thing in your outline, never be afraid to change a name and make it more distinct. Because even if the reader isn't confusing the two, there may be like a subconscious thing where you just miss it a little bit. How important is that character if they sound just like the other one? It's not distinct enough. The other thing I think is worth mentioning is kind of what you said, Johnny, about, introduce one at a time. But one way to do that is economy of characters. So in the same book that I'm talking about now, right, at the end of the first chapter, our character needs to get a phone call. And in that phone call, it's basically setting up the next chapter. It doesn't matter. But that phone call could have come from anybody. Like anybody could have made that phone call. And so why have it be anybody? It would have just been like another deputy or front desk, or it could have been anybody telling him this, but instead, I specifically made sure it was somebody who would be introduced in the next scene. And so I'm just able to, at the very end, I've only introduced two characters in this first chapter, but now at the very end, he gets a call from Simpson. And now in the next scene, Simpson, who there are no other Simpsons or similar sounding names, when you see Simpson in the next scene, you've already kind of got a tease that this character is coming, and now you get an answer to the question that was very quietly asked of the reader in the previous chapter. So that kind of like quiet introduction and then follow it up later, rather than having an extra character to keep track of, because the reader's like, who is this guy calling? Is he important?
Yeah, I've got a lot of respect for economical characters in general. Like I don't know if this is just something in my brain, but I always notice when a movie only has a handful of characters, and I always remark on it. Alien, 7 characters. That's all that's in that entire movie. you know, what was it that I watched recently where there were only like really 3 characters or something like that? I always love that, especially if it's like a claustrophobic sort of thing. I mean, The Hateful Eight, right? I assume there's only, I actually haven't seen it, but I'm assuming there's basically those 8 guys in that cabin.
Yes.
So I really like the idea of this is a limited, I always notice it with movies because I always think like they did a lot with a little, like that's usually the way I look at it, but it also makes it really, really easy to keep track of them. And a lot of times you don't need that bloat. So I always respect that. All right. Well, my recorder ran out of batteries. So, well, good thing we recorded this on the cloud. You're going to get that. So anything else to add? Any final thoughts?
I guess in terms of final thoughts, like we've talked about a lot of different things, but everything we've talked about, you can tap into as some way of kind of getting a hold on your character's emotional logic, whether it's something functional, like whether or not they're going to be an everyman or a realistic character over the top, or whether it's something like worldview or character arc. It's just ultimately, it's always something that is helping you understand how that person is going to make decisions. So like if you like listen to all these tips and you're like, none of those things really help me, like that's okay. There's probably something that you're already using that's helping you understand how your characters are making decisions.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you for being on again, Bonnie. Everybody, this is a great show, and I know everybody always really enjoys it.
Yeah.
Yay on that. And next week we'll have our Dave back. Have our Dave back. We'll have that Dave dynamic again. And
I feel like I dropped the ball. I should have had a couple of Daveyisms.
If I had my sound app, then I could have opened the Dropbox or whatever and started playing Dave clips and pretended he was here. Can you guys just raise my child for a few years? That was one that he said. Oh, I spelled juice all over myself. All right. So I guess thanks everybody for listening, and we'll see you next time. And peace out. That's what Sean says.
Peace out.
Bye-bye.